You can count on CenterPoint Energy to provide you with reliable, affordable energy. You've partnered with us to cut emissions by millions of tons. We'll achieve even more together while we pursue exciting new clean energy opportunities. CenterPoint Energy, always there.
Texas public schools are more than just buildings, more than an institution. Wherever teaching and learning take place, we must stand together with our public schools because a strong Texas recovery requires strong public schools.
Since 1920, Texas Realtors has been the leading advocate for Texas real estate consumers. Visit texasrealestate.com to learn more.
Today's world is not stopping for anyone, and being able to pivot and look ahead as you make tomorrow happen today is how we do things here at FritoLay. Because we are always striving to be one step ahead, focusing our efforts on consumer satisfaction and preference by bringing them new products, faster delivery methods, more categories, and all while trying to be more sustainable. Because we want our legacy to be even bigger than us. As we develop and implement our winning in the marketplace strategy, we have implemented key components in our plan that bring change and purpose while providing the tools and knowledge to be in the forefront, always optimizing and creating new opportunities for growth. But our commitment goes well beyond the business aspect, because we want our legacy to be bigger than us, which is why we have set our goals very high. We have expanded our commitment to bring high-quality jobs and opportunities to our communities to benefit now and in generations to come. We have also started implementing big changes with an even bigger positive impact on our sustainability efforts, like ensuring all our potatoes are 100% sustainably sourced, or optimizing our water usage to save 30 million gallons, which is as much as over 40 Olympic-sized pools. We are also on pace to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by the year 2030. In 2020, we achieved 100% renewable electricity for all U.S. plants, offices, and distribution centers. And if that was not enough, we are also working towards revolutionizing our packaging as we pilot the next generation of compostable packaging materials, while taking a step closer to a world where plastic need never become waste. Here at FritoLay, our commitment is not only to you today, but to the generations of tomorrow as we lay ground to a brighter and bigger future for all.
Hi, I'm Ross Ramsey. On behalf of the Texas Tribune, I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Texas Tribune Festival. Our guest this morning is Glenn Hegar, the Comptroller of Texas. He's the state's 36th Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. Started in November 2014 when he was elected. He's the Chief Financial Officer of the state's treasurer, check writer, tax collector, procurement officer, and revenue estimator. Before his election, he served in the Texas House of Representatives and in the Texas Senate. He's a graduate of Texas A&M and of the law school at St. Mary's University. Hager's a sixth-generation Texan. He grew up farming land that's been in his family since the mid-1800s. Comptroller, welcome. We've been talking off and on over the last year and a half about what's going on in Texas finance and the economy, particularly with a pandemic going on. And I guess wanted to get an update from you on all of that, see where we are, see where we're going. You're sort of one of the things that's not listed in your bio is that you're kind of the state's financial fortune teller. So I guess the easiest question is the broadest one. How are things right now?
Yeah, in Texas, at least from a revenue perspective, the last 5 months have been the best months that we've actually ever had in the state of Texas. Remarkably, if you look at all the taxes we collect here in the state of Texas, sales tax is 60% of all tax collections. And so to put in perspective, Texas in the last 5 months have had the best sales tax collections we have ever had, hands down, in the state. And then additionally into that, say motor vehicle sales tax. And I know you think, well, wait, when I drive down the road, I don't see that many cars on the lots. Well, people have been buying them at unprecedented levels. So combination of things, people have engaged in the economy, even though unfortunately with the increased caseloads and the Delta variant, people, continuing to telework to large degrees, if you're capable to, people have really engaged in the economy over the summer. And so, but the real question is, that we all want to know, especially myself as telling policymakers and the public in the general, is what is the ultimate trajectory of the state economy? So we've been through a lot in the last few years, but still, when we started this, I told people a couple more months of data was really going to be important. And a year and a half later, I'm still saying a couple more months of data is really important, because the point being, we've had a good run of 5 months, but the ultimate trajectory is still a little cloudy and fuzzy to see what is it going to be here in the state and the nation and ultimately the global economy.
I'm curious about how the future has looked over this period. The first time we had one of these conversations was, I think, at the end of March or the beginning of April 2020, which seems like about 30 years ago. But the outlook at that time was, everybody was scared. A lot of lawmakers were telling me that, I just had a private conversation with the comptroller and everybody came out of there scared to death. We had a conversation about how things might look. It got much better by July. It went down again. It came back up toward the beginning of the year. And as the regular session began, now it's really bright. I'm curious if this is changes in circumstances or if this is just kind of a general cloud of uncertainty that we've been in and that we might be in going forward.
Well, I think really the first point is, of the last 18 months, there really has been a continued cloud of uncertainty. And really what that uncertainty means is, what is the ultimate trajectory for the next year, for the next 2 years, which, as you know, we budget in a 2-year cycle. So the outlook that me and my team had provided is a really long outlook, and much longer than most of us do in our own households and in our own businesses. And so, we're taking it on the month to month, but also that further outlook. And if you go way back in the beginning of the pandemic, we all knew something was going to happen. Something was going on. 60 million people in lockdown in China. This seems more serious than what we've had with other types of outbreaks of something similar. But no one envisioned there would be a global pandemic, much less businesses would be shut down. People would start teleworking if they can. So all of these things were unprecedented for a lifetime. And you had no real data. We had historical decreases in some of the revenue collections here in the state of Texas there in the months of April and May when businesses were shut down. So as you mentioned, a lot of people were panicked. I mean, really scared. So part of what I was trying to say is, Texas economy started this on a really strong footing. We had one of the best economic engines in really the nation and the world. And so let's take a deep breath. Let's get a little bit of data. As we provided an estimate last summer, it was obviously more negative. You didn't know if there were federal monies, how much to level would we cut the state budget. And then once we got in, as you mentioned, in June and July of last year, revenues were not as deep as we thought they were going to be. So they started rebounding. People were buying unprecedented items at their households. They were doing home repair projects. They were buying things that they could do outdoor activities. And then as we got in the fall, that uncertainty continued, but it wasn't as negative as we thought it may be, like the great financial crisis. And then obviously once we got to the last 5 months, it's been really much better than we would have anticipated and most states would have anticipated. But again, the question leads, what is the next 5 months, the next 6 months, the next year? And that's the part, it's just really hard to determine what is that trajectory of that forecast. While we think it's optimistic, you just don't want to be too overly optimistic because legislators are depending on the numbers that we're providing them.
Are you starting to get any sense, this is probably an unfair question, are you starting to get any sense at all of what the normal economy looks like going forward? You know, I know for just normal people, you know, we had this time when we went to social distancing and then masks and things were bad. And then this spring, things looked pretty good and it looked like we're going to return to normal. And then COVID comes back and we're in masks again. Are you getting any kind of solid idea how this economy looks going forward, or is that just going to be an uncertain thing for a while?
Yeah, I think the ultimate answer to that is, you know, the point that I tried to make when we entered in this in the beginning is that Texas entered in on a strong footing. And I feel like overall the trajectory, while during the pandemic we may not be outpacing the national economy, we're going to get back to that level. And we're seeing that Texas is continuing to grow. But I think over the course of the last 18 months, the sands have really shifted multiple times in that suddenly businesses were shut down. People had to telework. That meant we had record drops in many of the tax collections, whether it was hotel stays, sales tax collections, motor vehicles. All of these revenue streams dropped just unbelievably. So we're trying to calm people down that, you know, we have a healthy rainy day fund balance, or a state savings account, that is. And while we don't have good certainty, let's take a pause and get some data. And then when we got to last summer, June and July, people were buying unprecedented levels of items in and around their homes, doing home repair projects, buying workout equipment, things to do outdoors, because they were looking for things to do. And so, you know, you could tell that people were engaging in the economy through November of March of this year, November of last year. While sales tax was down, it really wasn't down at those record levels. And so it seemed a little more optimistic, even though those continued clouds. And with the Delta variant, you know that obviously that's going to have some drag effect, but then we ultimately get to the point being of the last 5 months have been unprecedented. And so therefore, there's a lot of continuous shifting of that sand to be able to give what is the true outlook for 1 year, 2 year. And so really the point that I've made ever since I began in this office over 7 years ago is, as we see data change, we're going to let people know. And it seems like about every 2 to 3 months, we're giving a little bit new update, whether it's an uptick or a downtick. And I think we're probably going to continue to be in that every couple of month refresh of the information, the data, all the things that we're looking at, just to make people know exactly what are we thinking. And if it's changing, why do we think it's changing? Even though if it's just a small percentage, still, when you're talking about the 9th largest economy in the world, a small change can be a significant impact to the state treasury.
Yeah. Texas lucked out a little bit in changing its sales tax laws right before the pandemic. You offered a lot of encouragement on this. The state legislature jumped in, and I'm talking about online sales and the sales taxes from that. As we shifted to a pandemic economy and the delivery trucks started rolling through the neighborhood every 15 minutes, you know, one of the things that seemed to hold up the revenue of the state was the sales taxes on online. Could you talk about that a little bit, and whether you think that's a permanent shift?
No, it is a permanent shift. And that's one that, you know, for me, I had advocated strongly once the U.S. Supreme Court had made that decision that the legislature needed to update and make sure we had that capability to make sure that marketplace providers collected sales tax, sent it to the state of Texas. And to me, it was a competitive disadvantage for the local stores in your own community. If you go down the street and you buy something, you had to pay sales tax. But if you buy it online, that's a competitive advantage for a company that's out of state. They're not even in your community. So, this really was a fairness issue. And in the beginning, in 2019, we had told the legislature we thought that this might mean about $500 million in a 12-month period to the state treasury in that first year. And in fact, fortunately, we were wrong, in part because people were buying more items online than we anticipated. Other states were seeing the same thing as they begin to collect some of these dollars. But then also the pandemic. And the pandemic has really drove people to buy more items online and have them shipped to their homes. And so in that first year, instead of $500 million to the treasury, it was $1.2 billion. And in the last 22 months that the bill has been in effect, because it wasn't the full 24 months of the last 2-year biennium, but the last 22 months, it was $2.7 billion to the state treasury. And that's been an additional $750 million to local governments. And so that fairness of putting everyone in an equal playing field was even more critical during a pandemic when those businesses were having even harder time having patrons to come into their stores. So that was an added important piece of helping Texas in the last 18 months through this pandemic, several combination of issues, but that was a major piece that has really filled some voids that would have existed if the legislature didn't take that action back in the 2019 session.
Okay, let me take a little bit of a wonky sidetrack for a second. There's an argument over what they call sales tax nexus going on right now. I guess, this is tax lawyers and people like that, accountants, talking about where does the sales tax go? So if I buy something at a store, the sales tax receipts from that go to the city where I bought it, to the state. If I buy something online, there's a question about whether it should go to the place where I ordered it or the place where I live. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way we purchase items today, it's very different than just a year ago, much less 2, 5, 10, and 20 years ago when state statutes were put into place. And so therefore, in looking at what is really where sales tax should go and what is truth in taxation, that you and I, who are the taxpayers, pay something, and where do we expect those dollars to go? And if we walk into a store, a place of business, well, obviously we think that it is collected there and paid to that local community as a portion of their local sales tax dollars. But if you and I purchase something online, we really didn't envision as taxpayers that everybody purchasing across the state of Texas in a particular business, that all of those local sales tax dollars are essentially funneled to a city. And then that city makes an agreement to send back 70 to 80% of our local sales tax dollars to the company. Now, I can't blame the company or the city if they're able to do that, but You and I don't quite envision that we're going to send our sales tax money to the other end of the state of Texas. I mean, what about our roads? What about our infrastructure and police? And so therefore, my office has put into place some clarifications that we think that if it's not going to a place of business is where it's purchased, if it's not fulfilled here at a place of business in the state, then it should really go to the destination. And so obviously there's a few cities that don't like that interpretation and that clarification on our part. And so therefore there's a lawsuit with the state. Imagine that, lawsuits over taxes. And so we have postponed the implementation of that one piece of our rule as a result of the legislation in 2019. And we'll be arguing about that in court, as you mentioned, with the lawyers come next year. And ultimately, I feel like we'll end up prevailing because it's the right thing. You and I don't anticipate that our local sales tax are actually going somewhere else across the state of Texas. It's a truth in taxation issue.
Okay. One of the things that has arguably helped or been, at least a big influx of money during the pandemic has been federal funding, starting with the Trump administration, continuing into the Biden administration. I think Texas still has $16 billion that the legislature is just now getting into allocating to local governments and to other things. How big a factor has that been in the state's recovery, that just this influx of federal money, and how's that influenced, the game that you're watching?
Yeah, if you go back to last summer, as in 2020, essentially being on calls with the other treasurers around the other 49 states of the nation, there were a lot of people panicked. really worried about how they were actually going to pay their bills. And so you started having this push for federal dollars, not just to states, local governments, metro authorities, all these different entities. Nobody was taking toll roads anymore. I mean, there was no one on the roads. How are they going to pay the bonds and be able to pay the indebtedness? And so then the trajectory changed, but that legislation continued to move through last year and this year through the different packages. And so I think, that is one piece of a multiple number of pieces. One, as we talked earlier, people, at least middle income and higher income, who were not impacted. I mean, don't forget, we went from a record low unemployment of just over 4% to 13%. At the high of the pandemic. A lot of people were impacted, but the people who were not impacted in their jobs, they continued to engage in the economy. The online sales tax money, as we mentioned, the state of Texas cut its budget, which helped the budgeting situation. But the piece that you're mentioning, the last piece, is a huge influx of federal money. And if you look at the state budget overall, not necessarily last year, this year, and the next year, some of these dollars are stair-stepped over time, in part, say, public education, because we had a tremendous number of kids that were doing virtual online, which is an important piece if you can't be in the classroom, but it's not a supplement to being with a teacher. And so therefore, those dollars overnight, you're not going to remediate that kid, but it's going to take several years. And so my point being, even though these dollars are put into the economy over time in the state of Texas through the state budget, we're talking about over $75 billion. Either for specific program purposes or, as you mentioned, the $16 billion yet to be allocated and appropriated by the legislature when they come back in special session here in a few weeks, how they're going to spend those dollars. And if you look at the entire state of Texas, Ross, whether it's through the state, whether it's through local governments, people, individuals that got stimulus checks or businesses, you're talking about over $270 billion in federal money flowing to the state of Texas. And so therefore, whether we agree or disagree, the federal government should have done what they did. In the fact that they did it, that obviously helped make sure the economy continued to be propped up. Now, I'll just say in fairness, that's good for the economy today, but it also is a little concerning because at some point, as I kind of tell my kids all the time, nothing's for free. We got to pay it back at some point. And so, what does that really do? And I think that's reason it also provides a little more cloudiness to the overall outlook of the economy when we get out several more years. Because while that helped prop up the economy in the last 18 months and today, what does that really do to the ultimate picture? And part of that, we just don't really know at this point.
Right. As we watched the legislature this year, through the regular session and the special sessions, the way they budgeted, in some ways, this is a little bit like a science fiction deal where you look exactly like the Glenn Hegar that I talked to in April 2020, but it's like you're from a different state. At that time, we were talking about maybe the state's going to be short $4 or $5 billion. The legislature seemed pretty flush and had a lot of money. And in fact, had money for things that they weren't considering before. The governor and the legislature put a lot of money into border security that, didn't appear to be there before. They went from $800 million every 2 years, I believe, to something on the order of $3 billion. They spent a lot of money here and there. Are those sustainable? Is that sustainable spending, or does that look like one-time spending to you? I mean, as you watch this money come in and as you watch the uncertainty around this, are we at a sustainable level of spending right now, do you think?
Yeah, I think for the basic elements of state government, if you look at the state budget overall, there's really four categories that's 90+% of the state budget. And that's going to be in public education, higher education. So education is one. Health and human services is going to be a second, whether a large part of that is Medicaid. And one of the additional parts of federal dollars that has come roughly over the course of the last 18 months and through the rest of this year is an increased match in Medicaid from the federal government to all states. And that's been an additional $2 billion, which in part there's more people on the roll. So that has been another piece that's helped the state treasury. That'll go down, but so will the Medicaid rolls. And then also you have obviously law enforcement, as well as trying to make sure that we have, economic development, which a large portion of that is transportation. And so my point being is those basic pieces of the budget continue to be sustainable in the good and the bad times. That's the reason we have a state savings account. But I do think there are some they're going to be one time, and they need to be one time, because with that large infusion of federal dollars, you can't really continue to sustain that. And so that's the one thing that, I've been around this process long enough and trying to make my points to legislators is, at least don't put yourself in a box that this has to be a recurring expense. Say, for example, my office last session, Texas finally entered into the majority of states in the nation by creating a broadband development office. As we've talked about broadband expansion across the state for economic development, but in the last 18 months, it's not just about economic development, it's about telemedicine. It's also about education. And so therefore, we were one of 6 states that didn't have a development office. And finally, on September 1, now we've become part of the majority in the nation, but that's going to take dollars. And so therefore, those are dollars, but those are really kind of one-time dollars to how do we incentivize companies across portions of the state for the new digital highway of the 21st century. And I just use that as one example that while that's a continued effort, it's really a one-time type of infusion of dollars. And I think the legislature has looked at it that way. The border security issue that we all talk about, I mean, it is very real and very, unfortunate for so many, not just landowners, but kind of humanitarian crisis. Well, obviously we need to put dollars into that, but hopefully that is not going to be, an ongoing issue in 2, 3, 4 years. And that's something the state can ratchet back as we would need to, as that issue is being dealt with at a much better level than what it is today.
Do you see let me ask you a sort of political question. Do you see the federal government stepping into that? The old line was, when you were in the legislature, the line was, look, this is a federal problem. This is a federal responsibility, and it ought to be a federal expense. And I think, this governor, I think Governor Perry before him, were both saying, we're going to do some enforcement on the border, but we expect the federal government, whatever administration we were in, to pay us back at some point. Is that a pipe dream?
Well, I think unfortunately, and not to really try to make it too political, but under this administration, I think it is. And I think it's going to take, a leadership change to put a different focus on that. And so, until then, the state is going to have to step up and do more. And the state has done more, but principally that was targeted in the past for violent type individuals, crime, drugs, those type of influential resources. It wasn't to a humanitarian issue to where really it's just such a number of people that are coming. And, I was just talking to a neighbor. My family has a place over close to the border, and I'm going with my son this weekend. But, when we drive out there Friday night, I'm going to stay at the local hotel. I'm not going to show up at our camp because I don't know who's going to be out there, and I don't want to, put them nor us in an uncompromised situation. And we've had a lot of people coming through, and they're not invited guests. And so therefore, it is a real issue, and for the landowners who live there all the time, but it's a real humanitarian type issue, and it's been unprecedented. And so I think, the state has to do something to try to help resolve the issue of what's going on, around the border. And it's not just at the border, that trickles into the next counties and the next county. So I do think, unfortunately, right now, it probably is, as you quoted, kind of that pipe dream under the current elected situation in DC.
Okay. Let me get back to the state budget for a minute. One of the things for years that we've talked about in the state budget is public education. As you said, it's a huge part of the budget. There's a balance that goes back and forth between this much of public education is funded by local property taxes, this much of is funded by state taxes. And for a long time, increasing property values have meant that the local share went up and the state share went down. So when our property taxes go up, it's kind of a blessing for the state of Texas because the state of Texas's cost goes down. In the current budget, there's several $1 billion that the state has in hand that it didn't necessarily expect because property values went up and our property taxes are paying a greater share. In 2019, the legislature did a lot of change to school finance. And I'm curious if that back and forth that we've been through all these years and that we're in right now is gonna abate some. And do you see some relief there? And do you see some added state expense coming up?
Yeah, I do see added state expense coming on. What we've had historically in school finance is, for kind of explain to people, it's 2 buckets. And as you mentioned, it's the local property taxpayers, us, as well as us as state taxpayers. And essentially what would happen over time is as property values go up, our local share increases, so the state side goes down. It's kind of like a seesaw. One side goes up, one side goes down. The buckets have to equal a certain amount. And so therefore, after about 10 years, it gets imbalanced and the legislature says, oh, we need to correct this. And so they'd put an infusion of money, bring the seesaw back in balance. And then over 10 years, guess what? It'd get out of balance again. And so in 2019, the legislature in dealing in school finance put a significant investment from the state side, but also put more limitations on how much the local share could go up per year. So in the past, it could go up, not that it always would, but up to potentially 8% across the entire state on the local side going up. Well, now that's 2.5%. And so therefore, really what that means on a sustainable, ongoing basis, and the legislature is attempting to continue to compress the local school tax rates over time. And as those rates get compressed, then the state has to fill the bucket up more. And so I think, the answer is real simple, is that the state share, it's going to continue to go up because of that compression. But then also the local bucket is now attempted to be held down more. And so that forces the state to have to continue to keep in. And one of the points that I made before the legislature came in is, I said, look, there's a historical average of what the local and the state share is. And we are to just target the state side and say, this is what it's going to be, and kind of lock ourselves in. And so it doesn't get imbalanced. And so they did it in a little bit different mechanism, but I think the end effort was to really accomplish that same goal, as the state has a certain commitment and keep that commitment and not let the two buckets get out of balance, where in a decade you have to rebalance them again.
Okay. We'll see if it works. I guess we got 8 years to roll.
Yeah. We'll talk about school finance in 10 more years. We always do. That's part of
talking about it for the last 45. Might as well.
Some of these have a cycle, and that's going to have a cycle just like other issues. Hopefully it's not me and you talking about it.
Before we get out of here, I want to ask you another COVID question. And that is, what are you seeing as you watch the economy that you think are permanent changes from this? There's been a lot of conversation and a lot written in the business press about, what does this mean for commercial real estate? What does this mean, for how retail sales go? Are you seeing, as the controller and as you watch the economy, some things that you think are, this is going to be different from here on out?
Yeah, I think several things. One, we talked about one of them earlier, is that while local retail shops are not going to go away, people actually want to get out, want to go to a local store. It's going to continue to look a little bit different, and you're going to continue to see more delivery trucks showing up at your house with delivery. So that online presence, that's going to continue to increase. And we've seen that increase pretty substantially in the last 2 years. And I think it's going to continue on that trajectory. Then secondly, teleworking. I was telling my team that we need to find a better work balance, whether it's being in the office or out of the office, working from remotely, working from home or somewhere else, just for a lifestyle balance and not sitting in traffic. Well, I think we're definitely going to be that way. And I say we as a society. Now, you still need to have a presence in the office. I mean, for new employees, for a culture, they have to be around other people. And while this is a great format, it doesn't supplement. And so I think a lot of us businesses are continuing, in large operations, small operations, are continuing to redefine that. But I do think that's permanent. I think you're also going to see people working in different parts of the state, which is why I mentioned the broadband is more important than ever before, to have that connectivity, because people now say, well, I would work from place X rather than Y if I could do that, but I can't. And so I think you're going to see several things like that. But I would say those sands are continuing to shift a little bit as we're continuing to define it. I don't think that this is a permanent issue, but I think it's going to be a lot longer on the tail than most have anticipated. Is a supply chain issue. Labor issue is very real, even though we're not at the same historic unemployment levels as we were before. We're still at 6.5%. More business owners today complain about the availability of labor than they did pre-pandemic. And so, that supply chain issue, those I think are going to take a lot longer. That's not permanent, but I at least want to point that out, that I think for the next X number of months or several years, we're going to still continue to deal with that supply chain issue, especially since we're tied to the global economy. And as other countries are continuing to deal with different variants of COVID, that's going to continue to impact that supply chain of items that Texans and U.S. citizens are consuming and or making. And so that may not be permanent, but it is kind of what feels like a permanent problem of what we're trying to deal with, at least for the next several months and or potentially, unfortunately, several years.
Okay. One last question. We're headed into a political year. You're up for re-election if you're going to do it, or are you running for re-election?
Yeah, I've decided that I'm going to serve one more term, or ask the voters to, that is, ask the voters to serve one more term in the controller's office. So I didn't envision, serving 2 terms and now asking the voters for 3 terms. But as I told my wife and my 3 kids, 3 is going to be enough for Glenn. So, I don't know what that will be in 4 years from now, but I think we've done some good things here at the office. I got a few more things like the broadband office and others that the legislature's given me. And I feel like, I need to stick around to make sure we accomplish some of the tasks that we've been given. But I'll ask him not to give me any more tasks in another 4 years, because I'm going to hand it over to somebody else.
Okay, great. We will leave it there. Be something to watch next year. Glenn Hegar, thank you very much for the time. Thank you all for watching. I'm Ross Ramsey, and you're watching TribFest 21.